True love has the ability to transcend time, defy distances, and survive life's most merciless storms. At the center of this unforgettable story are Konstantin and Yelena, a couple whose passion has weathered thousands of miles of separation and years of uncertainty. They not only faced the horror of war, but also the painful weight, the anguish of the unknown, and the unpredictable changes of fate. This is not just a romance story, but a testimony to the strength of an unbreakable feeling. Since ancient times, poets and writers have tried to capture the essence of eternal love. Stories of lovers separated by war are not rare, but few reflect perseverance and faith in waiting as intensely as this one. Konstantin, a young Russian soldier, and Yelena, a woman with a free spirit and a burning heart, saw their destinies intertwined in a narrative marked by promises, letters, silence, and, finally, reunion. Our goal, in telling this story, is not only to move, but also to reflect on what it means to truly love someone. Can a feeling survive years of uncertainty? Can a single promise be strong enough to stand the test of time? War has a cruel way of ripping away people's dreams, disrupting plans, and redesigning the future without warning. To Konstantin and Yelena, the war represented a forced pause in their journey together, a hiatus filled with fear and hope. In difficult times, they clung to something no one could take away: the words written in their letters. Ink became a substitute for touch, and each envelope carried a piece of their hearts. However, life does not always go the way we want. Amidst the destruction, letters stopped arriving, promises began to seem empty, and Yelena faced a dilemma: move forward or wait. Konstantin, in turn, trapped by the brutalities of war, he questioned whether he would ever return to the arms of the woman he loved. In this story, we will explore each phase of this journey in exciting detail, from the first look that brought the two young people together to the moment of forced goodbye, through the torturous silence of absence and the surprising discovery that, many years later, would lead them to reunion. Each chapter of this narrative carries with it a fragment of a love that refused to die. If you've ever wondered if love can resist anything, if promises can survive time, or if destiny really acts in favor of those who wait, get ready to dive into this fascinating story. Welcome to the love that endured thousands of miles and years of waiting. The greatest loves in history usually begin with a simple meeting, a moment that seems casual, but which, in fact, carries the weight of destiny. To Konstantin and Yelena, that day was engraved in their memories as the moment their souls recognized each other, long before they could understand the impact that meeting would have on their lives. It was a cold late afternoon in Moscow, and the streets were covered in a thin layer of snow. Winter was coming early that year, and people were walking hurriedly, seeking the warmth of their homes or a cozy cafe. It was precisely in a small cafe, hidden among the city's historic alleys, that Konstantin and Yelena, they saw each other for the first time. Yelena, a young woman with lively eyes and dark hair, used to frequent that place after work. She loved people watching as she sipped her tea, making up stories for each unfamiliar face that passed by. For her, that cafe was a refuge, a place where she could get lost in her own thoughts and dream of a better future. Konstantin, on the other hand, was not a regular at coffee shops. As an army cadet, his days were filled with training and strict discipline. But that afternoon, pushed by a friend who insisted they needed a moment's rest, he walked into the cafe, unaware that his life was about to change forever. The cafe was full, and Konstantin had difficulty finding a place to sit. As he looked around, his eyes fixed on Yelena, who was alone at a table by the window, absent-mindedly stirring the sugar in her cup of tea. Absent-mindedly. He couldn't explain why, but something about her attracted him immediately. Taking courage, he approached. "Excuse me, the cafe is crowded. Would you mind if I sat here?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling his heart beating faster. Yelena, she raised her eyes and looked at him for a brief moment. There was something about his presence that made her hesitate for a second before responding. "Of course, feel free," she said, stirring her tea again, but now with a slight smile on her lips. The silence between them was short-lived. Konstantin, accustomed to leading conversations among soldiers, did not let shyness dominate the situation. He asked questions about the book that Yelena had it next to the cup, and soon they were talking as if they were old friends. They discovered common interests, from their passion for literature to the way they saw life. The conversation flowed naturally. Yelena Felt like he had never spoken to someone like that before, as if his words were heard, not just with his ears, but with his heart. Konstantin, in turn, was fascinated by the young woman's intelligence and free spirit. The minutes turned into hours, and before they knew it, night had already fallen over Moscow. The cafe was closing, but neither of them wanted to leave. They walked together through the streets lit by old lanterns, feeling the cold air and the magic of the moment. "I think this was one of the most unexpected days of my life," he said, Yelena, looking at Konstantin with a different sparkle in her eyes. He smiled, stopping for a moment to look at her. "And one of the most special," he replied, holding her hand for the first time. That night, as they said goodbye, they promised to meet again. None of them knew that destiny would test them in unimaginable ways, that simple coffee would be the beginning of a journey marked by pain, separation, and, above all, unshakable love. To Yelena, Konstantin, he wasn't just a nice guy he met by chance. He was someone who made your heart beat faster, who brought color to a world that always seemed gray. To Konstantin, Yelena, it was the reason why, for the first time in his life, he wanted to defy fate and dream of something other than war. They didn't know it, but time was not on their side. And that same night, while they slept with smiles on their lips, the war was preparing to put them to the test. After the first meeting at the cafe, Konstantin and Yelena, they started seeing each other frequently. The connection that emerged between them that night deepened with each conversation, each look, each moment shared. At first, they seemed like just two young people in love, living in innocent love. But they soon realized that what they felt went far beyond a simple, fleeting romance. It was something solid, intense, a bond that seemed to be written in the stars. Moscow's harsh winter turned outdoor meetings into small adventures, but that didn't stop them from strolling through the snow-covered streets, hand in hand, dreaming of a future that seemed promising. In the parks, amidst laughter and whispered statements, they talked about what they wanted for their lives. A simple house, perhaps on the outskirts of the city, away from the noise and rush of modern life. They talked about children, about traveling, about growing old together. Despite the joy they shared, there was a shadow hanging over them. War. Konstantin, as an army cadet, knew he would soon be called to serve. The conflict unfolding in Europe was getting closer, and the call for new soldiers was just a matter of time. Yelena, I avoided talking about it, as if ignoring the subject could take away reality. But Konstantin, I knew I needed to be honest. If war calls me, I will go. But that doesn't mean I will stop loving you. Never. She didn't respond immediately. He looked at the snow accumulated on the ground, trying to hold back the tears. He knew that war separated families, destroyed bonds, took men away and didn't always bring them back. What if you don't come back? He finally asked, his voice breaking. Konstantin, he held her face gently, forcing her to look at him. I will be back. For you, for us. On the eve of his summons, Konstantin made a decision. I didn't want to leave without first guaranteeing the Yelena that no matter what happened, his heart belonged to her. It was then that, on a freezing night, in the same cafe where it all started, he asked her to marry him. I know the war will make everything more difficult. I know I can't promise I'll be back soon. But I can promise that as long as I breathe, you will be the reason I exist. Will you marry me, Yelena? The tears she had been trying to hold back for the past few days finally fell. But this time they were tears of emotion. Try, she said, throwing herself into his arms. They didn't have a ring at that time. They didn't have a ceremony. They didn't have witnesses. Just pure love and a commitment sealed by the heart. That same night, sitting side by side on a bench in a snowy square, they made a pact. They would write letters to each other whenever they could. It would be his words that would keep them together, that would serve as a bridge between two worlds separated by war. Each letter will be a promise that we are still together, that we have not given up on each other. Yelena, she held his hands tightly, as if trying to record the warmth of his touch for the cold days to come. What if I don't receive your letters? He asked, fearing the silence that the war could impose between them. Konstantin, he looked at her seriously. So, keep writing, never stop, because even if I can't respond, your every word will reach me. The war had not yet begun for them, but their farewell was already on the horizon. They knew the future was uncertain, but that night, under Moscow's starry sky, with their fingers intertwined and their hearts racing, they made the most important promise of their lives. They would wait for each other, at any cost. If this story has already touched your heart so far, imagine what is yet to come. Konstantin and Yelena promised a future together, but the war is about to cruelly separate them. Will this love survive distance and time? You need to know what happens next. Before we continue, I have a very special request for you. Leave your like right now. This helps this video reach more people who, like you, love emotional stories. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This way, you don't miss any details of the next incredible stories we have to tell. Now, take a deep breath, because the hardest time for Konstantin and Yelena is coming. Continue with the video and discover how the war will test the promise they made. Can love really resist anything? Let's continue this journey together. The promise of a future together was sealed, but destiny soon put Konstantin and Yelena proof. The war, which until then seemed a distant specter, finally reached them in all its brutality. The call came on a cold morning. The sky was grey, as if reflecting the sadness that would soon take over the city. Konstantin, he received a short and direct telegram. He was to report to the barracks the following morning. There was no time for elaborate goodbyes, no space for long reflections. The war waited for no one. When he heard the news, his heart sank. In a way he had never imagined possible. She always knew this day would come, but when it finally did, it felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. That night, Konstantin and Yelena, they met in the same cafe where it all started. The atmosphere that was once filled with laughter and passionate glances now carried a silent weight. They barely touched the drinks in front of them. There wasn't much to say, just the fear of the unknown and the uncertainty of tomorrow. "Do you promise you'll come back?" he asked Yelena, his voice shaking despite trying to sound strong. Konstantin, he held her hands in his. They were cold, but the warmth of his touch was the only thing that still felt real. "I promise. Nothing can stop me from coming back to you." She nodded, trying to believe it. But the war was unpredictable, cruel. How many promised to return and never returned? The farewell was silent. They walked to the house, Yelena holding hands, feeling each step like a slow, painful goodbye. At the door, he kissed her gently, as if he wanted to engrave that moment in his memory for the dark days to come. "Wait for me. Keep writing." She just nodded, tears threatening to fall. The next morning, Konstantin left. The train station was packed with soldiers, mothers, wives and brides in desperate farewells. The sound of the train whistle cut through the freezing air, mixing with the sobs of those left behind. Yelena was among them, holding a letter he wrote the night before. She handed it to Konstantin before he boarded. "Read it when you're on the way." He took the envelope and kept it close to his heart. The train started to move. Konstantin stood at the door, looking at Yelena until his image disappeared over the horizon. She stayed there, motionless, until the last carriage disappeared. The following days were lonely. Yelena, he walked around the city as if he were in a bad dream. Every corner of Moscow reminded him of him. The cafe, the parks, the streets, where they walked. Letters became his refuge. Every day I wrote to Konstantin, even without knowing when he would receive them. He poured into them his love, his fears, his hopes. The first response arrived 3 weeks later. It was a short letter, but enough to calm his heart. "My beloved Yelena, I am fine. The training is hard, but your memory makes me stronger. Your love is my greatest weapon against fear. Keep writing. I will always be waiting for your words." She clutched the letter to her chest and cried. About that, Konstantin faced the harsh reality of war. The training was intense, but nothing prepared him for the horror of the trenches. The biting cold, the incessant sound of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder and blood. Everything was much worse than he had imagined. In the first few months, the letters were frequent. But as the war progressed, Konstantin's responses began to lag. "Yelena, I tried not to despair." He knew that soldiers could not always write, that mail was unreliable. But the absence of news was eating her up inside. There were nights when she woke up scared, dreaming about Konstantin in the midst of battles, calling his name. The war was taking him far away. And Yelena, I felt that every day without a letter was a day closer to losing him forever. Newspapers reported about brutal battles. "Yelena, I read each line with a heavy heart, looking for any mention of the unity of Konstantin. But there were no names, just numbers, dead and missing." And then came a period of absolute silence. no letters for months. The war had separated them. But would it have also erased the promise they made? Yelena wouldn't give up hoping. But until when? In the first months after leaving Konstantin, the only thing that kept Yelena the promise was firm that they would write whenever possible. The letters were the only thread that connected them, a small consolation in the midst of the cruel distance imposed by the war. To Konstantin, the words of Yelena, they were a piece of home in the midst of chaos. To Yelena, each sealed envelope was a guarantee that he was still alive. The exchange of letters began as soon as Konstantin arrived at the training camp. His first messages were short, but filled with affection and hope. My beloved Yelena, the days are long and cold, but thinking about you warms me. I close my eyes and imagine your laugh, your touch, your eyes. This gives me strength. Know that every step I take for you. No matter what happens, I will come back. With eternal love, Konstantin. When reading the first letter, Yelena cried. Her heart ached with longing, but at the same time, feeling close to him, even through paper, was a relief. That same night, he picked up his pen and wrote back, My Konstantin, the city seems empty without you. I walk around the places we used to go and I find myself waiting for you to show up at any moment. I know war separates us now, but my heart is still by your side. Write to me whenever you can. Never let silence keep us away. Forever yours, Yelena. The letters soon became a ritual. Yelena I wrote every night before going to sleep, telling him about his day, about the memories he had of them together, about the hope of seeing him again. Sometimes I asked simple things, if he was eating well, if he was cold, if he could sleep. Small details that, in times of peace, might have gone unnoticed, but now meant everything. Konstantin, in turn, wrote whenever he could find a moment to rest. Some letters were sent days apart, others took weeks to arrive. But whenever an envelope with his handwriting appeared in the mailbox, his heart Yelena was filled with relief and joy. In his letters, he talked about training, about the companions he had made, about the exhausting routine. But most of all, he talked about her. My sweet Yelena, the days are hard, but every time I close my eyes, I see you and everything seems bearable. Today it snowed, and, for a moment, I imagined that we were walking together through the streets of Moscow. How I wanted to hold your hand right now, but I promise I'll be back to do it. Wait for me. With all the love, Konstantin. The war separated their bodies, but words kept their souls together. To Konstantin, read letters from Yelena. It was a reminder that there was something beyond the trenches, beyond the cold, beyond the fear of death. To Yelena, each line written by Konstantin, it was proof that he was still alive, fighting to get back to her. But as time passed, the letters began to take longer. Yelena, she counted the days between one and the next. And when an envelope didn't arrive in the expected time, anxiety consumed her. Had something happened? Was he still okay? She wrote even without answers, as he had asked. My dear Konstantin, the days are longer without your words. I try to stay strong, but the silence scares me. Please, if you can, write to me. Tell me you're okay. With love, Yelena. She sent that letter and waited, but the answer didn't come. Weeks passed without a single news of Konstantin. Yelena, he tried to convince himself that the mail was slow because of the war, but fear began to grow inside her. What would happen if he never wrote again? The city of Moscow was also beginning to change. The conflict intensified, and people talked about the war with grim faces. Families received telegrams notifying them of husbands, brothers, and sons killed in battle. The fear that one of these telegrams was going to her haunted her every night. But then, one rainy afternoon, when Yelena had already begun to lose hope, a letter finally arrived. My beloved Yelena, forgive me for the silence. We were sent to the front lines faster than we expected, and the conditions here are difficult. But I'm alive, and that's all that matters. Your eyes remain my light, even when everything around seems dark. Please never stop writing. Your words are the only thing that still keeps me human. With eternal love, Konstantin. As you read these words, Yelena, he fell to his knees and cried. He was still alive. He still thought about her. But she knew the war was getting more dangerous. The time of sweet and frequent letters was coming to an end. The true test of their love was just beginning. The first months of the war were marked by frequently exchanged letters. Despite the distance, Konstantin and Yelena, they kept love alive through words. But as the fighting intensified, letters began to arrive less frequently, and hope was slowly replaced by the anguish of uncertainty. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Time passed, but the war continued. Yelena, I woke up every morning with the same routine, checking the mailbox. Each envelope that didn't arrive was another day of uncertainty. At first, she managed to endure the wait patiently, repeating to herself that Konstantin, it was okay, he would still come back. But as the months passed, silence became an enemy as fearsome as war. She tried to keep herself busy to keep the bad thoughts away. I worked longer hours, helped neighbors, read books, wrote letters, but nothing could fill the emptiness that grew inside her. The streets of Moscow were changed. The happy faces of young people had been replaced by sad, apprehensive looks. Every week, new news of dead soldiers arrived, and Yelena feared that the name of Konstantin was on one of these lists. While Yelena fought against uncertainty, Konstantin faced a completely different battle. Winter arrived relentlessly at the front. Snow covered the battlefields, and the cold penetrated to the bone. Military uniforms were too thin to protect them from freezing temperatures, and many soldiers succumbed not only to enemy bullets, but also to hunger and cold. Konstantin held the letters. Yelena, inside the inside pocket of your jacket, close to your heart. On the hardest nights, when darkness and fear took over, he would pick up the letters and read them again. Every word written by Yelena, it reminded him why he was fighting. He needed to survive. I needed to get back to her. But the war forgave no one. With each passing day, the danger increased. In one of the most risky missions, the Konstantin was sent to territory taken by the enemy. The mission was simple on paper, but extremely dangerous in reality. He and his companions were ambushed and forced to retreat. In the midst of chaos, Konstantin, he was grazed in the shoulder. The pain was intense, but not lethal. He crawled to a makeshift shelter and pressed on the wound to contain the blood. He looked up at the sky, thinking about Yelena. If he died there, she would never know what happened to him. I would never receive a goodbye letter. He couldn't allow that to happen. That night, as the cold wind howled over the battlefield, Konstantin took a piece of paper and wrote a letter that he was never sure if Yelena would receive. My beloved Yelena, if this is my last letter, I want you to know that every day by your side was the greatest gift of my life. You gave me something to fight for, something that kept my heart warm even on the coldest nights. If I don't come back, promise me you will continue living, that you will find joy even without me. But if somehow fate permits, I will return, because no war can stop me from wanting to be by your side. With eternal love, Konstantin. He put the letter in his pocket, determined to survive. Back to Moscow, Yelena began to lose hope. It had been months since I had received a letter, and the fear that Konstantin was dead grew stronger every day. I heard stories of women who waited for years only to receive devastating news. He saw mothers crying for their children who never returned, wives receiving telegrams that sealed their grief. The friends of Yelena, they began to advise her, maybe it's time to move on. But how could she move forward without knowing what happened to her? Konstantin, how could I forget someone who promised to come back? The years began to pass. Yelena, he continued writing letters, even without answers. Time has made many women who were in the same situation give up waiting. Some remarried. Others left to start their lives again elsewhere. But Yelena, no. Even as the streets of Moscow were rebuilt, even as new faces appeared around her, she refused to accept that the war had taken Konstantin forever. But the big question was he still alive? And if he was, would he ever return to her? The soldiers continued to fight. Time continued to pass. But for Yelena, the clock had stopped on the day Konstantin left. The war separated them. Time tested them. Now, all that was left was to wait and see if their love could really withstand anything. The silence was the worst part. Time dragged on cruelly. Yelena, and the lack of news from Konstantin. He made every day an endurance test for his hope. If before the letters were a relief from his longing, now they were just a reminder of what had once been. The certainty that he was still alive. But what now? Where was he? Would he still be alive? Or had the war taken him forever? She tried to keep the faith, but the fear of loss grew inside her like a shadow. The war spared no one. Moscow was full of rumors and news coming from the front. Some true, others just rumors spread out of desperation. Newspapers published lists of dead soldiers, prisoners, and missing people. Every time Yelena he saw a new bulletin posted on a public bulletin board, his heart was racing. Would it be this time that he would find Konstantin's name there? She avoided looking, but at the same time, she needed to know. I couldn't bear to receive the news unexpectedly, but his name never appeared, which was a relief and, at the same time, torture. Neighbors began to comment, if he hasn't written in so long, it could be that he fell in combat. Maybe he was taken prisoner, or worse, he could be somewhere injured, with no chance of returning. She hated hearing those words, but deep down, I knew any of these possibilities were real. Over time, Yelena began to dream about Konstantin almost every night. Some dreams were beautiful, full of happy memories, where he came home, smiling, ready to wrap her in his arms. But most were nightmares. She saw him on the battlefield, bloodied, lying on the ground, calling to her with a desperate look. In others, he saw a letter being delivered to his door, a telegram announcing his death. He woke up sweating, crying, and spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the dark ceiling, wondering if his dreams were an omen or just a reflection of his greatest fears. People around her began to urge Yelena to move on. You're young, you can't waste your life waiting for someone who might never come back. War changes people. Even if he comes back, he might not be the same Konstantin as before. But she refused to believe their love was so fragile. If he were alive, he would come back to her. I had to go back. Even so, doubt crept into his heart. What if he really never came back? One night, Yelena went to the small neighborhood church and lit a candle for Konstantin. If he is alive, please let him come back to me. But if he's already gone, give me strength to bear this pain. She knelt down and stayed there for a long time, silent, but there was no response. Just the cold of the night and the silence that seemed to suffocate her. Then, on an ordinary day, when Yelena had almost convinced herself that she would never hear from her again, a letter arrived. She could barely breathe when she saw the envelope with Konstantin's handwriting. His fingers shook as he opened it. My beloved Yelena, forgive me for the silence. The war took me further away than I imagined, and for a long time I couldn't write. I went through things that I will never be able to describe in words. But know that, in every difficult day, you were my light. The thought of meeting you again is what keeps me alive. I still don't know when I'll be able to return, but I ask you not to give up on me. Our love still endures. With all my heart, Konstantin. Tears fell down Yelena's face. He was alive. The war was not yet over, and uncertainty continued. But hope, which seemed ready to die, rekindled within her. She would keep waiting. No matter how difficult it was, he wouldn't let the fear of loss overcome the love that united them. Months passed, and the war continued without showing signs of truce. Yelena maintained the routine of writing letters to Konstantin, but lately I seemed to be writing into a void. The responses, which had previously come even at long intervals, had now completely ceased. She tried to convince herself that it was just a delay in the mail, that the soldiers were constantly moving, and that was why the letters took a long time to arrive. But the prolonged silence began to turn into a nightmare. Mornings that were once full of hope had become a burden. Every day, Yelena, I walked to the mailbox with a mixture of anxiety and fear. And every day, I returned home empty-handed. She asked postal workers if there were delays, but the answer was always the same. The war made it difficult to transport mail. Many letters get lost along the way. This meant that maybe Konstantin was writing, but his words never reached her. Or, worse, that he was no longer there to write them. Fear became a constant. What if he was injured? What if you were in a field hospital, without the strength to hold a pen? What if he was dead? The uncertainty was cruel. Unlike receiving definitive news, which would at least end the anguish, silence did not provide answers. It just created an endless abyss, where hope and despair mixed together. Before Yelena, he used to cling to happy memories, but now, with each day without news, his mind began to create dark scenarios. She tried to concentrate on work, but thoughts about Konstantin consumed it. She began to have difficulty sleeping. Many nights she would wake up with a start, feeling as if she had heard his voice calling her name. Other times, she dreamed of a postman knocking on her door, bringing a terrible telegram that she refused to read. Loneliness weighed heavily. She observed other women in the city who had lost their husbands, and in the war. Some were still grieving, Others had come to terms and were trying to move on. Yelena didn't know which group she belonged to. How could I move forward without knowing the truth? Moscow was different. News about the war came like a cold wind through the streets, bringing more and more reports of brutal battles and significant casualties. Newspapers published long lists of names of dead or missing soldiers. She still hadn't found the name of Konstantin there, but that didn't mean he was safe. Many soldiers were never officially declared dead. They simply disappeared, as if they had been swallowed by the war. Neighbors and acquaintances, who had previously offered words of comfort, began to speak in more realistic tones. If he were alive, he would have given news by now. Sometimes it's better to accept the truth and move on. War steals many things, Yelena. We can't fight it. But she refused to believe it. Their love was too strong to simply disappear in the middle of war. One night, in the midst of a bout of despair, he decided to write one last letter, even though he didn't know if it would reach its destination. My dear Konstantin, it's been a long time since your last letter, and every day without hearing from you is a torment. I don't know where you are, or if you're okay, but I need to believe that there's still a chance that this letter will reach you. If you can, please write to me. Give me a sign. Just tell me you're alive. With eternal love, Yelena. She sent the letter the next day and, once again, waited. The days turned into weeks. The weeks and months. Nothing. No response. No letter. No clues as to the whereabouts of Konstantin. Yelena, he started avoiding looking at the mailbox. She no longer knew whether she wanted to find a letter or whether she feared yet another disappointment. The war continued, but for her, it seemed like her life was on hold. There was no advancement, there was no regression, just an eternal void, filled with silence and uncertainty. But then one day, when she least expected it, something finally happened. A telegram arrived at his door, and the life of Yelena, it would never be the same again. Years passed, and finally the war came to an end. The streets of Moscow were filled with crowds celebrating victory, hugging each other, crying with relief and hope. For many, this was the day they had waited so long for, the day their husbands, brothers and sons would finally return home. But for Yelena, the war did not end that day. She blended into the crowd at the train station, watching each soldier as they disembarked, desperately searching for the face of Konstantin. Her heart raced every time she saw a young man with dark hair and a military posture. But, one by one, they passed by, reuniting with their families, crying with joy in the arms of their wives and mothers, and Konstantin was not among them. Over the next few days, trains continued to arrive, with soldiers returning from the front. Yelena was there, waiting, every day. She saw the happiness in the eyes of the women who were reunited with their loved ones. But she also witnessed the tears of those who only received the emptiness of absence. Some soldiers returned, mutilated. Others had empty looks, as if a part of them had remained in the trenches forever. Every time a new train arrived, Yelena held her breath, waiting for Konstantin to be there. But he never was. She refused to accept the worst possibility. He had to be somewhere. Maybe he was injured. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe he was still returning from a more distant base. But doubt began to suffocate her. Throughout the war, families who lost loved ones received telegrams from the army reporting their death or disappearance. But Yelena never received anything. This could mean he was still alive, or it could mean he simply disappeared without a trace. Uncertainty was torment. If only she had an answer, she could start her grief. She could try to move on. But without any information, it was as if his life was suspended in time. Determined to find some clue as to the fate of Konstantin, Yelena began visiting military offices. Trying to obtain any information, she spent hours waiting in lines, talking to tired officers, reading endless lists of names of dead, wounded soldiers and prisoners of war. But the name of Konstantin, it was never on any list. On one of the visits, an officer looked at her with compassion and said, "If he's not on the death or prisoner lists, maybe he's just disappeared, missing." The word echoed in the mind of Yelena like a hammer hitting your heart. How does someone just disappear? How could someone who made promises, who wrote letters, who loved intensely simply cease to exist without any explanation? Over time, Moscow began to return to normal. The streets that were once full of returning soldiers were now silent. The marks of war were everywhere, but the city tried to move forward, except Yelena. She still wrote letters, even though she didn't know if Constantine one day I would read them. She still dreamed of him, still hoped to see him turning the corner on any given afternoon, with that smile that made her forget the world. But the days turned into weeks, the weeks in months, and nothing has changed. The friends of Yelena, they began to tell him that it was time to accept reality. Maybe he died and they never found his body. Maybe he was taken prisoner and will never return. Maybe I chose not to come back. That last hypothesis made her shudder. No, that wasn't possible. Constantine, I would never abandon her, he promised. But then, she began to wonder, what if something had happened that prevented him from returning? The thought that he might be alive, but trapped somewhere, alone and unaware that she was still waiting for him, tormented her every night. A year has passed, then two, and Yelena was still waiting, while the other women went on with their lives, remarrying, rebuilding their families. She refused to give up on Constantine. She returned to the train station from time to time, hoping for a miracle, until one day she decided she needed a definitive answer. If the army couldn't tell you what happened to Constantine, then she would find out herself. And that's how Yelena began the search for her great love, a search that would take her down unexpected paths, where the past and the present would mix in a twist that she could never have imagined. The years passed, and the war was behind us, but for Yelena, time seemed to have stopped. As the city rebuilt and people went on with their lives, it remained trapped in uncertainty. Constantine, was he still alive? If he was, why didn't he ever come back? And if he had died, why was there no official news? She tried to ignore these questions, but they came back every night, in the silence of her room, in the solitude of their walks through the streets they used to walk together. She was still waiting for him. At first, people understood his pain. It was said that it was natural to wait, that many families were still awaiting the return of missing soldiers. But as the years passed, others' patience began to wear thin. You can't wait forever, Yelena. If he were alive, he would have come back by now. Maybe it's time to move on. She heard these words, but she couldn't accept them. How could I move forward without an answer? How could she marry another man, build a new life, if a part of her still believed that Constantine could you come back? She was not naive. I knew that war transformed people. I knew that time changed everything. But the love she felt for him was still there, intact, waiting. There were times when Yelena, he thought about giving up the wait. She tried to convince herself that Constantine would not return, that he needed to rebuild his life. He accepted invitations from friends, went to social events, and even allowed himself to meet new people. But no man could fill the void he had left. No conversation had the spark of the ones they shared. No touch felt as natural as that of Constantine. She even accepted a dating proposal from a respectable and kind man who really liked her. But after a few weeks, he realized he was living a lie. She couldn't love another man until she was sure about his fate, Constantine, and so he broke off the relationship and returned to his solitude. At the bottom of a drawer, Yelena kept all the letters that Constantine sent to him during the war. Sometimes she reread them, as if the words could bring a piece of him back. The scent of the paper was gone, the edges of the letters were worn with time, but each word still carried the same emotion as when they were written. She also kept the small ring he had given her before he left, not a traditional engagement ring, but a silent promise that he would return. And whenever she doubted, she took that ring in her hands and repeated to herself, "He promised." But as more years passed, doubt began to grow. That's it, Constantine survived, but decided not to return. What if, somewhere, he had started his life over again, forgetting the promise they made? What if he had found another woman? That idea hurt more than the possibility that he was dead. If he were dead, she would at least know that he loved her until the end. But if I had chosen not to return, it would have meant she spent all these years waiting for someone who has already forgotten her. That thought tormented her, but still, she couldn't help but hope. After much reflection, Yelena, he realized that there was only one way to end the doubt. She needed to discover the truth for herself. If he was dead, he would find proof. If he was alive, he would find a way to find out. And so, she began her own search for Constantine. He went to military bases, talked to war veterans, looked for information in old newspapers. It discovered that many soldiers returned irregularly, without official records. Some returned injured and never looked for their families. Others were sent to prison camps, where they spent years before being able to return. Hope was reborn within her. Maybe he was alive, maybe he was stuck somewhere, maybe he was trying to get home. And, with this new certainty, Yelena decided she would do whatever was necessary to find him. While many women had accepted their losses and moved on, Yelena still believed. She knew that time could change many things, but it wouldn't change how I felt about Konstantin. If he was still somewhere in this world, she would find him. And so, his search began. What would she discover? Would time have been cruel to your love, or, against all odds, would Konstantin still be waiting for her? Time passed like a silent river, taking with it the years, the familiar faces, and the moments that once seemed immortal. Yelena never stopped searching for answers about the whereabouts of Konstantin. But, over time, life imposed itself on his pain. Youth melted away in front of the mirror, dark hair gained silver strands, and the city changed around it. She never married. He never found another man to fill the space. Konstantin left. She often wondered if she had made a mistake by clinging to a love that time insisted on erasing. But deep down, I always knew that until I had a definitive answer, I wouldn't be able to move forward. One day, many years after the end of the war, Yelena received an unexpected call from an old acquaintance from the time of his search for Konstantin. "There's something you need to see." The man, a historian and war archive researcher, said he had found old documents belonging to soldiers who never officially returned home. Among them, there were a diary, and inside that diary, there was a name written in firm letters. Konstantin Mikhail. Yelena felt her heart stop. After so many years of uncertainty, there was finally a thread of truth to be pulled. When he received the diary, "Yelena, I could barely breathe." His hands shook as he opened the weathered cover. The paper was yellowed, but the words Konstantin, they were still there, as alive as the day he wrote them. "My beloved Yelena, the war took me far away, but it never managed to erase you from my heart. I write these words because I fear I will never be able to return home. But if this letter ever reaches you, I want you to know that I never stopped loving you." The eyes of Yelena, they were filled with tears. He was alive after the war. He tried to get back to her, but what happened? Turning the pages in a hurry, she found his last notes. And then, the truth was revealed. Konstantin survived the war. But, in the post-war chaos, he was mistakenly captured and sent to a prison camp, accused of desertion due to a bureaucratic error. He spent years in prison, awaiting a trial that never took place. He wrote about how he thought about her every day, about how he imagined she would be waiting for him, just as he hoped for a miracle. On one of the last pages of the diary, he wrote, "If I ever get out of here, I'll look for you. If time has been cruel to us and you've already moved on, that's fine. But if there's still a chance, I'll find you." But there were no more pages, no clue if he made it out, where he could be now. Just make sure he tried. Yelena closed her eyes and let the tears fall down her face. The wait was not in vain. Their love truly survived. He never forgot her. But the war, the system, fate, they all conspired to tear them apart. And now, after so many decades, she found herself faced with a new question. Would Konstantin still be alive, even if he had survived the war? The years passed, he could be anywhere. I might no longer be in this world, but Yelena knew she couldn't stop now. Now that I finally had a clue, she would go all the way. Even if it took your whole life, she would find Konstantin. Their love, it hadn't come to an end yet. The diary of Konstantin was the missing piece of the puzzle that Yelena, he spent his life trying to assemble. He had survived the war, he had fought his way back, but he was unjustly imprisoned, with no chance to defend himself or warn her. The revelation came as a shock. For decades, Yelena had imagined countless scenarios to justify the disappearance of Konstantin. I had thought that he might have died on the battlefield, that he might have lost his memory, that he might have decided not to return. But never, not in his worst nightmares, did he consider that he had been silenced by the very country he swore to protect. Now, with the diary in hand, she knew there were still unanswered questions. "Yelena, I knew I couldn't rest until I found out what happened after Konstantin wrote those last words. Did he make it out of the prison camp, or did he die waiting for a rescue that never came?" She returned to the office of the historian who found the diary and asked for more information. He explained that the document was archived with records of soldiers detained in secret military prisons in the post-war period. Many of these men were considered deserters only because they were lost on the battlefield or because they returned too late. Constantine was one of those cases. The historian promised to help her search military records for any trace of what might have happened to him. Yelena returned home that night with a heavy heart. The truth was close, but still out of his reach. Days later, the historian contacted Yelena again. He had found something. Constantine was sent to a labor camp. Yelena felt the world spin. The Soviet Union, in its harsh system of military punishments, had sentenced innocent men to forced labor without the right to trial. Many never made it out alive. And did he get out of there? She asked, her voice shaking. The historian hesitated before answering. Yes, according to records, he was released years later. But after that, there is nothing more about him. No address, no mention in military archives. He simply disappeared. He was alive. But where did he go? Not knowing where else to look, Yelena decided to visit former military bases that were now museums, hoping to find any information. In one of them, a former officer, now retired, heard his story and became thoughtful. Many of those who left these camps did not want to return home. They felt betrayed by the government, by the army. Many went to distant villages, trying to rebuild their lives in anonymity. That made sense. Constantine, a faithful soldier, a man of honor, was treated as a traitor for a mistake he never made. Perhaps, upon his release, he decided there was no longer a home to return to. But did he even try to find her? That was the question that burned inside Yelena. She refused to believe that he simply agreed to disappear. Then something unexpected happened. One of the historian's contacts found a medical record of a patient in a military hospital, dated a few years after the end of the war. The patient's name, Konstantin Mikhailov. He was treated for severe pneumonia and malnutrition, possibly the result of years of deprivation in the forced labor camp. The document contained a crucial detail, the address where he was released, and there it was, a small, isolated village, far from Moscow. The heart of Yelena accelerated. Would it be possible? After so many years, would he still be there? The answer was just a trip away, and Yelena was determined to find him. With the address in hand, Yelena, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Time had already robbed her of decades of uncertainty and pain, and now, finally, she had direction. The village was remote, located miles from Moscow, one of those places forgotten by the world where few outsiders ventured. Yelena, I had never been there, but the name sounded familiar. Was it possible that Constantine had mentioned this place in one of his letters? Without hesitation, she packed her things and left. The train made its way slowly through the vast, silent fields. The landscape passed before her eyes like an unchanging painting, as if she were being transported back to the past, to the time when there was still hope. When Constantine, it was still a promise and not a painful memory. Every thump of the train on the tracks echoed in his chest. Would he still be there? If I were, would he remember her? Age had already transformed her face. Her body was no longer that of the young woman who said goodbye to Constantine at the Moscow station decades ago. But her heart, still belonged to him. When getting off the train, Yelena, he felt the cold wind touch his face. The village was small, rustic, almost untouched by time. People looked at her curiously, not knowing who that woman was coming from far away. She asked why Konstantin Mikhailov. Some didn't know the name. Others hesitated before answering, as if searching their memory for something forgotten, until an elderly woman, sitting at the door of a small wooden house, finally broke the silence. Constantine, the soldier, yes, he lived here, but it's been a long time. The heart of Yelena almost stopped. Is he still here? He asked. Holding his breath, the woman looked at her with gentle eyes, as if she understood the weight of that question. Maybe you'd better see for yourself. Guided by the woman Yelena, he crossed a narrow path that led to a small house out of the way, surrounded by tall trees and an unkempt garden. The path seemed endless. His heart pounded with each step. She was about to see him. After so many years, after so many doubts, after a lifetime of waiting, the door to the house was ajar. The woman left, her alone, and stepped back, as if she knew that moment belonged to just the two of them. With hands shaking, Yelena, he pushed the door slowly, and then she saw him. Sitting on a wooden chair next to the fireplace was a man aged by time, his hair gray, the marks of the past imprinted on his face. But your eyes, Your eyes were still the same, Constantine." For a moment, it seemed like time stopped. He raised his head slowly, as if he sensed her presence before he even saw her. And then, when their eyes met, reality crashed down on him. His eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but the words were torn out by shock. "Yelena." His voice was hoarse, fragile, but filled with disbelief. She couldn't respond. The tears fell before he could say anything. He still remembered. Slowly, Yelena walked towards him. Each step seemed like an eternity. She wanted to run. She wanted to hug him. She wanted to scream to the world that she had finally found him. When he finally stood before him, Constantine raised his trembling hand and touched his face, as if he wanted to make sure she was real. "I waited for you," he murmured, his eyes full of tears. Yelena held his hand in both of hers. "Me too." In that moment, all the questions, all the pain, all the wasted years became insignificant. They were together again, and nothing else mattered. The silence that filled the small room was unlike any other that Yelena had already experienced. It was no longer the cruel silence of uncertainty, nor the emptiness of waiting. It was the silence of two hearts that were finally reunited after decades of separation. The eyes of Constantine, even aged by time and suffering, they still had the same shine that she remembered. That glow that always gave her security, that look that made her fall in love so many decades ago. She felt a lump in her throat. How many times have you dreamed of this moment? How many nights did you wonder if he was still alive? If he still thought about her? If the war hadn't taken away from him the chance to return to your arms? Now, here he was, real, alive. But time had not waited for them. The eyes of Constantine glistened with tears as he held her hand. "You came to find me," he murmured, as if he still didn't believe that was true. Yelena nodded, squeezing his hand between hers. "I never stopped looking for you." He took a deep breath, his tired shoulders seeming to carry the weight of time. "I tried to go back, but after so many years in prison, after everything that happened, when I was finally released, I was no longer the same. I thought you had moved on." She felt her chest tighten. How many times did she also think that he had given up on her? "I never moved on, Constantine. You have always been my only love." Silence once again took over the environment. Words seemed too small to describe everything they had lost. Time was cruel. The war separated them, and destiny did not allow them to live everything they had dreamed of together. But there they were, even if it took a while for them to meet again. Constantine, with effort, he got up from the chair. His movements were slower, his body more fragile, but he still gathered the strength to stand before her. And then, he hugged her. Yelena closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel that moment. His arms around her were different from the ones she remembered. Thinner, weaker, but at the same time, they were exactly the same. It was like coming home. After a lifetime of exile, she tightened her arms around him, as if to make up for all the years they spent apart. Time may have stolen many things from them, but he couldn't erase the love that brought them together. As they stood there, hugging each other, flashes of the past flashed through their minds. Yelena, the first date at the cafe, walks through the park. The marriage proposal without a ring, but full of promises. The letters that kept them connected, even in the midst of war. The endless wait. She felt the breath of Constantine flutter against your shoulder. When she pulled away slightly to look at him, she noticed that he was crying too. "I thought I would never see you again," he whispered, his voice breaking. She smiled tenderly, cupping his face in her hands. "But I'm here." He nodded slowly, as if trying to accept the fact that this was no longer a dream or a distant memory. It was real. For a while, they just stood there, side by side, without needing to say anything. They didn't need words. In the background, they knew that time remaining was short. Their bodies were no longer the same. The decades of waiting marked them in irreversible ways. But, no matter how much time had passed, that moment was eternal. And then, Constantine held Yelena's hand firmly and smiled slightly. "I kept my promise. I came back to you." She felt tears roll down her face, but this time, they were tears of relief. "Yes, my love, you're back." At that moment, nothing else mattered. They were finally together. Even if for a short time, even if life had been cruel, even if fate had tried to separate them, their love, it has resisted time, war, and silence. And now, they could finally rest in peace. The reunion of Konstantin and Yelena, it was living proof that true love resists time, circumstances, and even the greatest tragedies. The war tried to separate them, fate tested them countless times, but in the end, what really mattered was that they never stopped loving each other. Not all loves survive distance, silence, and uncertainty. But when two hearts are destined to be together, not even decades can erase them. How many love stories never reach a happy ending because people give up halfway? How many feelings are forgotten due to time, rush, or fear of waiting? Yelena never gave up, and in the end, his wait was rewarded. But what about us? Are we valuing the loves we have in our lives? We live in times where everything is fast. People get tired easily. They give up on each other at the first difficulty. They believe that there is always another option instead of fighting for what really matters. But this story shows us that true love is more than a fleeting feeling. It's a choice. It is a promise made not just with words, but with actions. At the moment when Konstantin held hands Yelena and said, "I came back to you," he proved that even the greatest difficulties were not able to erase the commitment he made to her years before. It doesn't matter how much time has passed, they were still the same two young people who fell in love in the Moscow cafe, who promised to write letters, who dreamed of a future together. Yes, the war stole that future from them, but the love never went away. And in the end, that was enough. If this story teaches us anything, it's that true love is not lost. It just waits for the right moment to find itself again. Maybe you have someone you're still waiting for. Perhaps you are about to give up on a love due to fear, uncertainty, or disappointment. But remember, if it is true, he will always find a way to come back. Time can be cruel, life can be hard, but love always has the last word. And just like Konstantin and Yelena, maybe your reunion is still waiting for you somewhere in time. If this story touched your heart, you are not alone. The love of Konstantin and Yelena shows us that, despite distance, time, and challenges, true love never dies. And if this message made sense to you, then I want to make a special request. I brought this story to you with great affection, so that it can inspire and transform lives, just as it transformed mine. And now, you can return this moment of emotion with a simple gesture. Leave your like right now. This helps me continue bringing incredible stories like this to more people who need to believe in the power of love and hope. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. If this story moved you, imagine how many other inspiring stories are to come. Don't miss the chance to be part of this journey. Share this video with someone you love, someone who needs hope, someone who perhaps is waiting for a reunion, or who needs to believe that love always finds a way. What would you do instead, Yelena? Would you wait? Would you seek answers? Tell me in the comments. Your story can inspire others. True love transforms lives. And today, this story may have transformed yours. Now, help me take this message even further. Let's spread the power of love and hope together.